Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I just appreciate you watching. I do try to give out a lot of good information on here. Present things in a bit of a different way, show you some things, demonstrate some things, talk about some things. So I do appreciate you watching. Hopefully those of you who are watching are finding them useful. And so today we're talking about the next module, Module 8, and we're talking about basic CSS properties. I'm also going to go back and review a little bit because some of you seem to have found the concepts of classes and IDs just a little bit difficult. So we'll go back and, as we're kind of doing our demonstrations and such today, we'll go back and review those concepts as well. Not entirely sure why those were kind of a bit of a bugger to you all, but we'll go back and talk about those just a little bit more, just to try to make sure everybody understands them, although that would require people watch this to kind of figure that out. But we'll give people the benefit of the doubt. We'll believe that everybody that was having some issues with that will come back and watch this. But we are talking about some more basic CSS properties, right? So the box model, a little bit challenging that we were talking about last week, right? Our width, our height, our margin, our padding, our border, and then taking these different segments and adding them together to see, about how much screen real estate that things take up. And then, we talked about things like positioning, right? Relative positioning, static positioning, fixed positioning, absolute positioning, and sticky positioning. And then how we could kind of move things around on the screen with that, relative to top, bottom, left, and right. And that also gave us our introduction to CSS. And we basically said CSS was just a series of rules, right? We have a set of rules that we call a declaration block. Those declaration blocks are applied to elements in our HTML using a selector. That selector could be one of several selectors, an element selector, an ID selector, or a class selector. There are also other advanced selectors that we talk about in advanced classes. But that's neither here nor there for the time being. But we use this selector that goes through our HTML and it looks through our HTML. That's why we have to have that link in the head of our site that says, okay, so I know that my CSS file over here is connected to this HTML file because it has that link present. That's why we don't touch that. That's why we leave that there. So it knows to load that file and that it's associated with that. And it goes through and it says, okay, I'm going to find everything of that particular element, and I'm going to apply these rules to it. And so in this module, we are looking more at the fun stuff, right? And this is where I think some more things with CSS start to click for people, right? Because these are more like immediately visual changes that are made. One of the things that we saw last week with box model is that, sometimes when you make some of the changes, like with the width and the height and the margin and the padding, the changes that you make aren't necessarily immediately apparent, right? Like you make the changes, and unless you use that inspect element tool that we were using last week, and you see that little invisible box actually kind of pop up on the screen there, and you can kind of manipulate it and work with it, you're not really seeing how what you're doing makes changes. So with that being said, today we are going to look at some basic CSS properties, and that in particular is color and font. These are, kind of the big properties that everybody wants to change, right? So we're going to look at color, and when we're talking about color, we'll talk about both background color and text color. And we'll look at, time permitting, we'll look at some font stuff. Otherwise, it is there in your module for you to review the font stuff. But the big thing that we're dealing with here is color. And so by default, almost everything on a website is either black or white. We've seen that as we've kind of been dealing with it so far, right? We've been making these different sites, or we've been working on this one particular site so far, right? And we've been making different sites in our demonstrations over the last couple of weeks. And we've seen that everything's basically been black or white, right? Like the background of the site by default, the body of the site has been white, and then we put a black colored text on top of it. And that's basically been it. Right? That's all we've done. And that's kind of boring, right? Like that's basically the most boring thing that you can have. And so one of the first things that people want to customize really is the color. And so we have several different ways of changing and customizing colors of HTML elements using CSS. And for the purposes of this course, we primarily talk about just two of them, right? We talk about named colors and we talk about hexadecimal colors. And so the first thing that we talk about is named colors. And so all modern browsers support 140 named colors. And these are colors that have a special specified name. Right? And you can almost think about them as like a box of crayons. Right? If you go to Walmart or the office supply store and you get the nice big box of crayons, it has a bunch of different colors in it. Maybe roughly 140. If you look on the wrapper of all of those crayons, there's a name that's specified there for all of those crayons. Now, the name of the crayon doesn't necessarily match the name of the color in HTML/CSS here. Right? That's just kind of an analogy that we're making. Is the name of our crayon colors to the name of these colors in our CSS. But we do have these colors that we can name here. And there are 140 of them. And I actually have on the next slide a list of all 140 of these colors. And so let's just have a quick look at that here. Here they are. I think a couple of them on the bottom there might be cut off. Just looking at the recording really quickly here. Let me see if I can just remove that one there. So what we can see here is we can see these are our 140 named colors as presented to us in CSS, right? And some of these colors are pretty evident, right? We see red, we see blue, we see green, lime, pink, yellow, right? These are pretty obvious color names. Some of these color names are less obvious. Right? Like without prior knowledge, if somebody just came up to you and asked you, for example, what color family, say, let's find a good one. What color family Peru was in, would you be able to tell them? Would you be able to tell them it's kind of a muted orangey brown sort of color? Maybe with a little more red in it than orange. Right? Probably not, right? But it's called Peru. And so we see several things here about these colors, right? And one is that, while some of the colors are easy to remember, and we can figure them out, fairly quickly, others of them are quite complex to remember. So if we wanted some more nuanced color out of this named color list, we might have a bit of an issue. Also, there are only 140 colors here, which is a bit of a problem. Right? Because if I look at things, that sort of way, right? Like if I look at things in the world, there are millions upon millions upon millions of colors that our eyes can discern. And some of them, are very close to others, to where it'd be kind of difficult for our eyes to kind of pick out one or over another. But, there's over 16 million colors in the world. And we're left here with a representation of 140 colors to do all of our work, which isn't quite useful. Right, but we can still go a long way with this, so we can kind of take that with the understanding of, well, we do have some other ways that we can represent color that we will discuss in just a moment. But let's start out by just kind of examining how we can add color into our site using these named colors. So let me add that little privacy bar back there for just a moment. And we will switch over to a Replit window now. Let's do a few examples here. First of all, again, just to kind of call some things out, right? Notice that I have the link here in my HTML. That is linking to this style.css sheet that lets this HTML file, when it loads, right? If you remember back to module 2, when we talked about how the internet works, you remember back to that, right? One of the things we talked about was how the browser loads the files. We said it loads the HTML first, and then it uses the HTML to determine what it loads next. And so it uses the HTML here to determine the CSS that it loads. So it sees this link to this style sheet here. So it knows, okay, style.css. I know that file. It's right here. So I know I need to go back and load that into my site. Same thing for this script src equals script.js here at the bottom of the body. Right, that links to our script.js file here. So if that one's gone, you want to make sure that you bring that back before we get to module 9. Right, so let's just add ourselves a couple things in here. First, let's add a little main container here. So we'll add some main tags. And inside of this main tag, I'm going to give it an ID. ID equals container. Right, so now I've given that an ID. Remember, one of the things that I've said was that I would also kind of go back and review IDs in classes. Remember, that just kind of gives my HTML elements a specific sort of naming structure to where I can call it something special, to where I can, refer to it as something special in my HTML or in my CSS. So you see here in my opening tag, and we'll zoom in here so you can see it just a little bit better. Right before the greater than symbol in my opening tag, I put ID equals, and then the name of whatever I want to call my ID here. In this case, container. Right, and main is a semantic container tag, as we kind of discussed in module, what module was that? That would have been module 5, I believe. When we talked about main, main contains the main part of our site. It contains the main information for our site. So it's just a container that we can use to hold different things. An ID can be used on one particular element on a page. So I have that here. For our purposes here, let's also add an H1. And inside of this H1, let's give it a class. Class equals title. Let's call it title. Right, so a title also allows us to make some more specific selections in CSS, except unlike an ID, whereas as one particular ID name can only be used on one element, a class name can be used on multiple elements, and they don't have to be of the same type either. Right, they can be of multiple different element types. So for example, I might want to use class of title on H1s, H2s, and H3s, right? I could use it on whatever I wanted to. So we can write just, here's a, and I meant to put here's a title, right? Just so I can have some text on my screen. And let's throw a paragraph in here. We can give this one a class as well, right? So this can be, we can just call it body underscore text or body camel case text. Here is some article text, maybe, right? We'll just call it whatever we want to call it, right? All we're doing here is just adding some stuff to our site just so we can apply some color to it. And we will make sure we close that paragraph tag like so. Right, so now we just have a few things here that we can work with. Now, the first thing that I want to do for our purposes here is I want to set a background color for the entire site. Now, one of the things that we've talked about, and one of the things that might cause you some problems if you have not been doing your HTML in a standard compliant way up until this point, is that if I want to apply a background color to the entire site, I apply it to the body of my site. So I can apply it to the body element of my site. So if you haven't been putting your content inside the body, like you should have, if you haven't been putting your user displaying content inside the body, you might be at a point here where it's going to cause you some trouble. So in my CSS file here, I'm going to start out by focusing my body element selector, adding my curly braces to create my declaration block. And then I'm going to add my property for this declaration, which is background dash color. Now, there are two primary declarations for color, or two primary properties for color that we use. Background color, which is color for background. And when we're writing it in CSS, everything is dash. So background dash color would be the property here. And then we give it the value, which would be the name of the color. And if we look back at our named values that we can use here, let's find an interesting one here. Let's try medium sea green. Let's try medium sea green right there. And I can just add that in there without quotes, since that's a thing that can be understood just generally by my browser. So my browser knows medium sea green because it is one of the 140 named colors. So I can just add it as the value to this rule. So when I run this, you can see I have a medium sea green site with my title and my text on it. Now, one of the reasons why I did this with the main container, with the ID of container here, is because, especially when you use a dark color in the background, one of the things that you might notice here is there's not as much contrast between this text and the background that's behind it, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to read. So if I use a container like this, I can take that container and I can make it a lighter color and make that stand out. And, you know, this is one of the things that we see oftentimes, right? Like, it's one of the more common web design patterns that we see. So if I'm referring to this ID in my CSS, right, I refer to an ID in CSS by using a hashtag before the name of whatever I'm referring to, right? So basically writing the hashtag in my CSS is like writing ID equals in my HTML. So hashtag container here with my curly braces for my declaration block. Whenever my browser runs this file, it says, okay, hashtag container, that means ID container. I'm going to look through my HTML for an element that says ID equals container in it, and that's the element that I'm going to apply these rules to. So in here, I'm going to give it a background color of white. And when I run that, we see that it puts white behind that. And we'll pop that out just a little bit. And that's a little rough, right? That's a little, you know, that's a little not very interesting, right? But we know some things from the last module that can help us make that look a little bit better, right? We can use our box model properties. Like, for example, one of the things that we do is when we see something like this here and something like this here, where we have this extra margin on items before, you know, we really are working with anything. Well, what we might want to do is we might want to reset the margin on our HTML and our body so we're not starting with any margin or padding. So I can put margin 0 and padding 0 here in my HTML and body. And that will take it nice and snug over there to the left-hand side. And actually, one of the things that we talk about in the next level class, which would be the one that we do in the spring, is using something that is our asterisk selector or wildcard selector. And so if I were to do that in there, that would actually apply it to everything on the page, which would also mean it would also take it off of the top here and push it right up snug against the top, which is pretty nice because it's also taken the margin top off of this H1 here, which is what was pushing it down from the top of the page there. Another thing that I can do here, right, with my container is do some of the types of stuff that we were doing last week, right? Give it a width of like 960 pixels, give it a height of, let's say, I don't know, 1,000 pixels, right? It won't go all the way to the bottom, but it'll be pretty close. Or actually, yeah, it is. It does go all the way to the bottom because we have it. It's a 1080p monitor. So when we add in the top of the browser and my bar here at the bottom, that's plenty. And I can center it up using the margin trick. So that'd be margin 0 auto to center that up on the page. And that's going to center that main up on the page. And, you know, this is the type of thing that you've probably seen a lot with sites. Right, so now all of a sudden, we've gone from something that's just plain black text on a white background to having a nice, vibrant green background. with a white stripe down the middle of it to make the text stand out a little bit more. One of the things that I might want to do here is to add a little bit of padding to this main as well, just to bring it away from the sides just a little bit. So let's say 24 pixels, right? But just so we can kind of compensate here, so it's still 960 pixels wide, we can subtract 48 pixels from our width, which is going to leave us with 912 pixels wide there. And we can just bring it down in general to like 900 pixels tall and just be fine, I think. So let's give that a try. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So now we have this box going out in the middle of our page. We have a title in this box. We have some text in this box. Now, we're going to want to do a little something more here, but we have seen an example again of how we can add a background color to something. We've seen it done on the whole site, on the site as a whole, with the body here, and on this container element. But there are some other ways that we can do this as well, right? And so we can play with some of that here, but there is an issue, right? And we can kind of go back to this idea of these 140 color codes here as being an issue for us. Because there's not very many colors here. So in terms of color, there's actually 140 named colors, but over 16 million colors that we can represent in CSS. And we can do them in a whole bunch of different ways. In future classes, we talk about RGB or RGBA and HSL, or hue, saturation, and lightness colors. However, for the purpose of this class, we discuss hexadecimal colors. That's the place where we get started, hexadecimal colors. And hexadecimal colors allow us to get to over 16, they allow us to represent over 16 million colors using just 6 characters. And some of you might have encountered some hexadecimal in some other classes, right? Some of the networking students, as you're doing IPv6 is represented in hexadecimal, right? Hexadecimal is base 16. Let's talk about what that means. Base 16. So hexadecimal colors are actually, now colors in particular, when we look at a hexadecimal color, we see 6 characters. But they're not just 6 characters, right? They're actually 3 pairs of characters. So we can actually say that it's a hex triplet, right? Because it's 3 pairs. So it's a triplet of pairs, right? It kind of gets confusing. But what we want to do is when we see a number, that's represented in hex, we want to be able to kind of comprehend what that is and how to deal with it. Now, so it's 3 pairs, or 3 sets of 2 characters. The first 2 characters are the red value. The second 2 characters are the green value. And the final 2 characters, the last 2 or the third 2 characters, are the blue value. And these 2 characters range between 00 to FF, or if we were to take that hexadecimal and convert it to decimal notation, 0 to 255. And we can kind of think about these values as like a flashlight. Right? Digital color, we say digital color is in the additive color space, which means that we can add more color to it. Right? When you were young and when you were in school, When you were in kindergarten, first grade, and you were learning about colors, they told you the primary colors were red, yellow, and blue. And they were sort of right. Right? They were kind of lying to you. They were only sort of right because, one, they were working in what we call a subtractive color space. When we're working in a subtractive color space, we're actually taking away light that is bouncing off of an image by absorbing wavelengths of light via dyes and paints and things of that nature, right? Crayons, whatever you're using. So when you're mixing paint, you're working in a subtractive color space, and you can mix blue and yellow to make green. But when we are mixing light, like we're doing on a computer monitor, we're no longer working in a subtractive color space. We are working in an additive color space. And in an additive color space, our primary colors are red, green, and blue. And we can kind of think about each of these colors as a flashlight. And each of these corresponding flashlights has sort of a slider on the side of it. And that slider has an intensity value on it from 0 to 255. So I have a red flashlight with a slider on the side of it, a green flashlight with a slider on the side of it, and a blue flashlight with a slider on the side of it. So if I have all of these flashlights and their sliders are turned all the way down to 0, they're all off, I get black, right? There's no light there. It's just darkness. And so if we see something that is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, with the sliders all turned all the way down, we end up with black. But conversely, if we take and we flip all of those sliders all the way up, and they're all full intensity, if you've ever been in a theater, if you've ever gone to go see a play, right, and you've looked up at the lighting rigs, you might have noticed that the lights up in the rigging aren't just white lights. They're red, green, and blue. But when they're all up at full strength, all up in the same power together, it's white light that shows on the stage. When we mix red, green, and blue together at full intensity, when we have those flashlights turned all the way up to their most powerful, we get white. And so whenever we have our flashlights all set to the same value, regardless of what it is, we get some value along that grayscale, somewhere from black to white. So if they're all the same value, then we get somewhere some sort of gray. But it's when these flashlights start to gain dominance and one flashlight is shining brighter than the others that we start to get the color mixings. Now, let's look at this particular color. EB9707. And we'll talk about how this works, because we want to get a little bit technical here. We want to get a little bit technical here. So our color is EB9707. And I really need to turn the sensitivity of this mouse down, although I haven't done that yet. It's fine. We'll make it. We'll live. And so you might be saying, wait a minute, EB? What kind of number is that? What kind of number is E and B? Well, what we're used to is decimal. What we're used to is a numbering system called decimal, and decimal is base 10. Right? Remember, we've talked about this before when we talked about binary. And binary being base 2. Now we're talking about hexadecimal. Hexa, 6, decimal, 10. So it's 6 and 10. So this is base 16. So in our decimal numbering system, we only have 10 numbers that we use to represent numbers. 0 through 9. 10 doesn't exist. 10 isn't real. 11 doesn't exist. 11 isn't real. Right? 10 isn't a real number. 10 is just a 1 and a 0. 11 isn't a real number. 11 is just a 1 and a 1. Right? So in hexadecimal, what we're able to do here is we're able to expand past our numbering system. And we do that with letters. Right? So we start with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Right? So whenever we see an A in a hexadecimal value, we can think 10. Whenever we see a B in a hexadecimal value, we can think 11. Whenever we see a C, we can think 12. Whenever we see a D, we can think 13. E, 14. F, 15. So on and so forth. So when we see this B here, what that B actually is an 11. And what that E actually is a 14. Now let's talk about how we can convert these values from the hexadecimal values that we see here, because this 97 here is not a 97, it's 97 in hex. So it's not a 97 in decimal. Right? It's a different number in decimal. Because we have two place values here. 6 to the 0, or 16 to the 0, and 16 to the 1. Anything raised to the power of 0 is 1. Anything raised to the power of 1 is itself. So we take that first number, the number that's all the way to the right, and we multiply it by 1. We take the number that's on the left and we multiply it by 16, and we add those two numbers, and that's how we get the number changed into decimal. Right? So our EB, that is our red value. So let's calculate our red value here. EB is our red value. So we said here that B is the rough equivalent, or not the rough equivalent, but it is the equivalent of 11. And it is in the ones place. So 11 times 1 is 11. And we're going to add that to 14, which is in our 16s place. So what we'd want to do is we'd want to take 14 times 16, and we get 224. So we get 224 plus 11, which is going to be 235. That is our red value. Our red value is 235. We do the same thing with our green value. Right? Our second pair of numbers here is our green value. Seven times 1 is 7. Plus 9 times 16. 9 times 16 is 144. So that means this is 151 if we were to convert it into decimal. And our blue value here is pretty easy. Right, our last pair is our blue value. 7 times 1 is 7. 16 times 0 is 0. So it's just straight up 7. And so now we have a flashlight, our red flashlight, turned all the way up to 235. Our green flashlight turned to 151. And our blue flashlight turned to 7. And I can actually, I can tell you this value because, I'm used to this color. It's in my presentation. But the more that you work with hexadecimal values and the more that you learn these colors, the more you're like, yeah, I understand what that is. Right, so if I take full strength red plus full strength green with no blue, shine them at the wall, so 255 red plus 255 green plus 0 blue, that makes yellow. So what we have here is actually, it is sort of a reddish orange. Or a greenish orange, kind of a browny color. It's kind of a rough looking color here. We can kind of pull it up and bring it over. Hashtag EB9707. It's this sort of brownish orange. Right? Because since we have roughly twice the amount of red that we do green there, since equal parts red and green make yellow, then we add some more red in there. That's what gets us into the orange family. Since we're not quite full strength, it's a little bit darker. Since we add a little bit of blue in there, it's a little bit darker. And look at these values here, right? I Googled the hexadecimal value. Look at these RGB values here. There are those values that we just calculated. 235, 151, and 7. Right? So we did that correctly, which is pretty cool. And so one of the things that I like to do here is kind of a parlor trick, is I like to look at the named colors, and I'll tell people in the class, I'll say, pick one of the colors. If I have a seated class, and I'll say, pick one of these colors, and I will I'll write a hexadecimal color that's basically this color. Right, because I've worked with hexadecimal colors enough that I can get pretty close on the first try, and I can refine it a little bit if I need to get to where I need to be to get it exactly right, which is very interesting. Right, so let's just do one of these just for our sake. We can use something like if there's somebody in chat that wants to pick one out and put one in chat, I would love for that to happen, just so we can kind of do this demonstration. If you want to pick out one of these colors, I will convert it to hex and use it in our demo site that we're working on here. I see there are a couple people in there, but I don't know if they are paying attention or not. Caramel. That's a good one. Is that one of our named colors here? Trying to find it. I'd like to use one of our named colors so I can just have a point of reference. I can do something that's kind of a caramel color, which is going to be kind of that goldenrod color there. Although it's going to be pretty close to... it's going to actually be pretty close to what the demo color we just did. Oh, no, you're good. You're good. You're good. It's all good. Tell you what I'll do. We'll do a random number generator. One to 140. 25 is what it picked. We'll pull that over and show it. Question is, what is the best looking gray? Depends on the application. Right, me personally, I like, for most applications, I like 525252. I like that gray. I think it's a nice dark gray without being too dark. Flip that around and you get an even darker gray that I think is pretty good, 252525. If you need a light gray, I think CCC is actually a pretty good light gray. Tomato. The tomato color there is what our random number generator gives us. So let us try that out. And so let's try it here with our H1 title. Let's see, we gave that a class of .title. So we use .title in our CSS for that. And we'll do the color of the text for this one. And so to use, for the color of the text, we just use the term color instead of background color. So just color is for text. Background dash color is for the background. And then tomato. Tomato's kind of tough here, but it's going to be pretty close to being a full. So we want a full red. So I think I want a hashtag FF. We do want a little bit of green. Maybe about a quarter green to get it to there. This tomato is going to be a little bit tougher. So maybe something around, let's see, something that would be around a value of maybe 75. We could try that out. So if we were to kind of do that backwards, we would say 75 divided by 16 equals 4. So 4 times 16 is 64. And that would be 411. So that would be AB. So that would be 4B. 4B. Let's go 0, 0. That's kind of close. That's not quite. I mean, that's close to tomato. actually think I might want to add a little bit of blue to it to make it more tomato-ish. Not too bad. If we add a little bit of blue to it, it gets us pretty much there. So there's that color. If we look at it on our site here, pretty close, pretty close. And if we look at tomato there, it's pretty close. Might lean a little more orange-red than tomato, but it is pretty close. Might actually want to take a little bit of that out and maybe add a little bit more of that. But I'm not sure. We'll just kind of leave it where we're at, because that is pretty close. So I think we'll let it go. And yeah, in terms of grays, just to kind of give some gray demonstrations here, we'll let the cascade do the work here. Background dash color. One of my favorites is 525252. Right, remember, just so long as all three pairs are the same number, it's going to be a gray. So it's not quite fully black. It's kind of a darker. It's on the darker side, but it's not too dark. If you need a darker gray, 252525 I think is a good darker gray. I like that one. I like that one a lot, actually. And then in terms of a light gray, I kind of like CCC, actually, for that one. I think CCC is a good gray. And that's something that you might see occasionally as well, which is a good topic to bring up, is the idea that if you see just 3 characters in a hexadecimal color, the other one is assumed to be a 0. So that would basically be like writing C0, C0, C0. So CCC in this case would be the same as C0, C0, C0. All right, we've kind of given ourselves that shorthand if we have 3 characters. But that's also the only condition in which that works, is if we have just 3 characters, right? Because if we had somewhere between 4, if we had 4 or 5, it wouldn't know where to apply. It wouldn't know where to apply the 0, so it wouldn't work, right? So it's only 3 characters, so it would only be a gray, where you could do the 3-character hex color. Good, good, good. Now, I do tend to agree. Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you were able to find that useful. Yeah, and those 3 grays in particular are typically my go-to grays. Which is kind of weird, right? I typically talk about how, basically I have digital color is one of my favorite topics. I could probably create an entire class just about digital color. The topic is absolutely fascinating to me. The way that the additive color space works. So we've also gotten an example of our using a class here. So we're tying this class back to the class in our HTML here. Tying this ID back to this ID in our CSS here. Right, some good examples, some good examples. We can talk about font family a little really quickly before we go. There is some good stuff about font family in the module, and we have kind of reached our hour here, so we will just kind of talk about this really quickly. But font family is another rule property that I like to that I like to use a lot. And typically at this level, we're just using our web safe fonts. So for something like this, it would just be something like Verdana. Right, so I can add a font family Verdana. And in this case here, I can add it to my asterisk selector, and that would apply it to every item that's on my page. My paragraph, my H1, everything. Right, we can look at it over here as well. And I'm going to remove, for the sake of, I'm going to remove this body here for the sake of the file that I share. Verdana is a named font. It is a web font that is a web-safe font. In the module, it talks about other web-safe fonts. In general, what I will use instead of something like Verdana would be something like sans serif. And sans serif is just going to use the default sans serif font, which means it doesn't have all those little pointy bits that the serif font like Times New Roman would have. It would use the default font for whatever operating system that your user is using. So if they're using Windows, that would be Arial. If they are using a Mac, that'd be Helvetica. Linux would probably be something like Open Sans. Right, so on and so forth. And also, just really quickly, just so we can have a quick demonstration, I'm just going to put a little section. I'm going to give it an ID of just something like BG demo. And I'm just going to put it right in here inside of main, just so and I'm just going to give it a random hexadecimal color, just so you all can see that it's not just, I can use a hexadecimal color or a named color for the text color property, which is what we see here on line 25. And I'll even go so far as saying, oh, this is text color or we can use the name color. We can use any of the color properties for anything. So let's go for like a purple here to make just this little square that I'm just sticking in here really quickly. So a purple is going to be 2 times red than blue. So in this case, if we want a nice bright purple, we might go with something like FF00 Something that would be roughly 127. So let's go with like 90 or 80. All right, that's going to get me like a magenta. So that's going to be good enough for our demo here. So there's that little box there. So that's going to be good enough for our demo. And with that, we have hit our hour here. We've talked about color and done some demonstration and had some good times here for an hour. Let's even center this up just so we can do it. And so with that being said, that's where we'll go ahead and stop our live class for today. If anybody who is here live with me has any questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat. If you are watching the recording and you have any questions, you can just send those to me via email or via Teams, and I will answer those questions. But that is all that I have for you for today. We'll turn the music back on for a minute, and I'll just hang out in the chat and answer any questions that anybody has as we kind of wrap up. Once again, thank you all for watching. We'll see you all next week for another one. Thanks for watching.